If you ask an insect farming industry exec, they'll tell you 100% that insect protein will definitely solve climate change. If, however, you ask a vegan activist, they'll say all the data shows that insect farming is absolutely awful for the environment and that climate claims from the industry are suspicious. If you ask the UK government, you'll get a mixed answer, couched in conservative modelling that leaves out the real world effects. And if you ask researchers and policymakers in Africa, they'll tell you that none of this has much bearing on what they're doing and misses the point entirely. So, who's right and who is wrong? Well, to answer that, and what spurred me to make this video, a recent paper came out called "Have the Benefits of Insect Farming Been Overstated?" Hence the very creative title of this video. The paper took a big swing at the insect farming industry, threatening to invalidate many of the environmental claims that the industry has been making. Shortly after, in what seems like a pretty coincidental timing, Protix, the world's largest European factory producer and the market leader in insect protein products, came out with their own paper aiming to prove that the environmental benefits are indeed robust. So there's a lot riding on the answer to the question posed by that article and by this video. As ever, if you get value from this video, then please consider following me on LinkedIn, or please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and leave your thoughtful comments and your data and any observations you have from looking at this issue down below. Please stick around to the end, where I'll provide as definitive as an answer as I possibly can. So let's go. First up, the paper in question is Biteau et al. Biological Reviews 2025. This is a meta-review that takes aim at the field. It argues that if you take an insect factory in Europe running on fossil-heavy grid electricity and feeding larvae on purpose-grown grain or bran and using energy-intensive drying, the carbon footprint can actually be worse than soy or fish meal. And they looked at like 40 plus papers for this. They flagged key methodological issues in a lot of these: inconsistent functional units, an optimistic allocation of co-products, weak modeling of direct emissions like nitrous oxide and methane, and little consideration of real-world substrate sourcing, how it actually works in the factory. It's actually a solid critique, and within those kind of factory boundaries, the authors are basically right, I'd say. The European factory farm business model relies on tons of energy and critically uses byproducts that could have gone to feeding other animals or doing other things that weren't really waste. So as I have actually confirmed to me in confidence, a lot of these big factory players, not naming names, end up actually just using purpose-grown grains, defeating the purpose in the first place. I actually laid out my insect waste management thesis in another video, which kind of is in line with this, which I'll pin in the first comment down below. You can take a look at that after this. Then there's the UK government's agency study. It was Defra and Ricardo, an LCA of insect-derived protein done over 24 and 25. The key result in their baseline model was that insect protein is about 7 kgs of CO2 equivalent per kg of protein versus 2.2 for soy and 3.1 for fish meal. This was included in the last meta study, but I'm highlighting it as one to show you what the numbers are coming out for this traditional insect farming model. The conditions were UK productions with suboptimal drying and purpose-grown feed options were included. The important caveat is that this LCA excluded deforestation-based land use change for soy. So they explicitly note forest to crop conversion was not modeled, which I do see as a problem. So the insects lose conclusion out of this rests on parameters that absolutely do favor soy and penalize insect systems. Again, within that scope, their conclusion is basically correct, but the scope is a narrow one. They didn't fold in the actual land use patterns that would change when demand is rising for protein. Modeling land use change in the country of origin for soy is very difficult, and it's hard to equate insect protein, fish meal, and soy meal because they do have very different price points right now. Theoretically, if they all cost similar amounts, you could say that if demand for protein rises in animal feed, then the marginal protein must come from natural ecosystems being converted to productive land. Or, of course, from efficiencies on existing land. Assuming those are equal, you basically have to chop down more rainforest or catch more fish than you did last year if protein demand rises. If insects were at price parity, then with stable demand, every ton of insect protein would be displacing a marginal land use change. These studies don't model any of that. They assume that all soy is coming from existing farmland, which sort of misses the point of why there's a demand for alternative proteins in the first place. but it's messy to factor in real-world demand-supply feedback loops in global commodity production. There's a lot of merit in both of these analyses. Critically, both papers are saying that unless you're using actual real waste, the environmental impacts will be overstated, and you could even say might even be worse than what we're currently doing, or the status quo. So that's serious food for thoughts for industry incumbents. On the other side, industry papers, for example, by large players such as Protix, like the one on screen, argue that yes, but we're transitioning to renewables. We're using true waste feedstocks like potato peel and brewery spent grains, and we can displace fishmeal, which not only saves carbon, but protects marine ecosystems. Those are actually good arguments, but there's an important addendum. The industry insiders and journalists report that some large insect farms in Europe still rely heavily on substrates such as wheat bran or other purpose-grown crops rather than genuine waste streams. In other words, some marketing claims don't fully align with substrate realities. Just because you can model using waste doesn't mean that people actually do in reality. Transparency is super limited, and large-scale adoption still carries feedstock risks. So in reality, waste is messy and variable. It's not things that the current big players can tolerate, given the product strategy the industry has chosen, where it tries to take fish meal and soy meal head on. So yes, industry does have a credible narrative, but it also has internal inconsistencies that need some scrutiny. But to summarize the earlier point, this is where most LCAs, whether critical or favorable, fall short. They treat insect meal, soy meal, and fish meal as if they operate in isolation under a static demand. Real-world global feed systems are dynamic. What we often don't see is avoided land use change. So if soy expansion causes rainforest or savanna conversion, the emission pulses for soy is extremely large. Waste diversion credits. If insect farms treat organic waste that would otherwise be dumped or landfilled, you do unlock major potential methane and CO2 equivalent savings and avoidance benefits. When you expand the boundary this way, the insect case improves substantially. And that seems a fairer way to do it, given that's what alternative proteins really are trying to achieve. Now let's shift geographies. Consider this. A 2018 LCA in Indonesia found that small-scale BSF waste treatment facility produced 47 times less CO2 than windrow composting for the same waste. That was Mertenat et al. In 2018. And for Africa, there was a review in the African Journal of Environment and Natural Science in 2025, and that examined BSFL FRAS for urban agriculture in Cameroon and emphasized that the job creation, waste management, and fertilizer displacement benefits, though not full like LCA GHG numbers, were really important. So when you rerun the scenario in an African global south context, with that ambient temperature, the solar drying, the organic waste feedstocks, and local use, the insect case shift from likely a lot better than fish meal and probably competitive with soy for emissions, even against farmed soy. So what do we conclude from all this? Yes, the benefits of insect farming have been overstated when we look at European factory models. I think we can say that. High energy consumption, non-waste feedstocks, suboptimal drying, narrow system boundaries. Those LCAs, like including the DEFRA one, are correct in showing limited benefits under those conditions. But when you expand the system boundary and include avoided land use change, waste diversion, and substitution dynamics, and potentially even shift geography to warmer climates with lower energy processes and true waste feedstocks, the case not only rebounds, but it accumulates. And in those contexts, insect farming becomes not just equivalent, but potentially favorable to fish meal, and in some cases to soy. And so this is what I'm calling insect waste management in my last video. That's what I want for this industry. Ethically, if waste is diverted from open dumps, if job is created, and if marine or forest ecosystems are spared, including all the biodiversity concerns there, then the moral argument also becomes even stronger. Speaking of ethics, I also now want to address head-on the ethics of all this. Many critics of insect farming do have a clear ideological position regarding the sentience of insects. And this is by no means a settled science. In the UK, for example, certain crustaceans and cephalopods have now been classed as sentient, but farmed insects, including the black soldier fly, have not been. So their ethical status is debatable. Many understandably assume that any death of an animal should be avoided, and I'm deeply sympathetic to this. But I also have to balance those ethical concerns with an ethic of care towards human beings who suffer malnutrition and health hazards due to waste, especially in developing countries. Care should be taken not to present a pessimistic case that undermines the ability of insect bioconversion to transform the lives, incomes, and nutrition of some of the world's poorest people. I agree that the current industry seems unable or unwilling to center that as its principal aim. And I understand how it got here. And I also am empathetic, like how hard it is to pivot. But we also need to factor in human lives and the lack of protein in much of the world beyond. I'd add that pesticides and intensive agricultural practices to produce plant proteins as well do kill billions of insects each year, as well as many rodents whose sentience isn't in question. Not to mention the tremendous biodiversity loss and the cascading effects that has as it ripples across the ecosystems. So more soy could end up with more animal lives lost, depending on how it's modeled. Similarly, if there does, and I'm not saying there does, exist some insect farming executive who knows that the environmental benefits are weak in their particular business because they don't use waste or they've chosen to hide their head in the sand for personal gain, then yes, that too is a real ethical problem. It's possible to admit issues and be transparent while also having a plan to sort of like try and pivot. That's easier said than done in the high stakes environment of innovative business, so I do have empathy there. I'm just saying that those incentives heavily push one set of actors to discount any negatives, which is not healthy for those of us trying to get a fair analysis here. We must be careful not to trample over ethical concerns in one case, or to have too narrow a definition of what counts as our ethical calculus in the other. And I think that's just worth saying, not because I have the definitive answer or that because I'm a perfect human being, very far from it, but because the ideologies on both sides are really clearly advertised. And as many studies show, personal ideologies influence methodology, data presentation or omission, analysis, interpretation, and the resources available for dissemination. So maybe the right question isn't have the benefits been overstated, but rather in which systems or practices are the benefits real and under what assumptions do they then collapse. So I'll put links to all the key studies that I've mentioned in the description text so you can dig deeper. In my opinion, the benefits of using insects to produce feed, considering everything I've read and gone through, with all of my biases and imperfections, I'd say that the benefits are real and positive if waste is the focus, the business model is kept local, and low energy end product processing is minimal, and also that the modeling that you use accounts for marginal land use change. I also believe that in the global south and Africa, where I do a lot of work, that the social benefits on top of all of that make it a fairly undeniable ethical win too when you look at the whole calculus. If you do factor in some generosity for land use change, it's probably not as bad as the meta-analysis said, and it might be closer parity to Fishmeal, but more studies are going to have to confirm that. So as ever, if you found this useful, please hit the subscribe, leave a comment. What do you think about the emissions and ethics of insect farming? See you for the next one.